Hello, everyone. We will get started in just one moment. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Generosity Commission's webinar on tax incentives for charitable giving. My name is Kelly Gabbard, and I am a senior program lead with the Generosity Commission, and I will be the online moderator for today's webinar. During the presentation, everyone will be on mute, and we encourage you to use the Q&A function to ask questions. We will pause for questions at two different portions during today's presentations. Today's session is being recorded, and we will provide a link to the recording and as well as a download to any of the webinar materials following the session. With that, I will now turn it over to our host for today's webinar, John Tyler, who is the General Counsel, Secretary, and Chief Ethics Officer for the Kauffman Foundation. And John also served as the co-chair of the Policy Task Force for the Generosity Commission. John?
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you to all involved with putting this webinar together, and to those of you who are here and very much interested in this topic. We've got a wonderful session prepared with Daniel Hungerman and Brian Flavin to talk about what's coming in 2025 with the expiration of the Tax Cut Jobs Act provisions. One of the certainties for 2025 is that there will be tax changes, or at least tax discussions and presumably changes. Our experts will talk about whether they'll just move things forward or engage more deeply, which I suspect to be the reality. So this webinar does come out, as Kelly said, come out of the work of the Generosity Commission. The Generosity Commission was formally put together in 2021 after a few years of discussion among people in the commission's work, then looking at the 20-year trend in the declining number of people who donate money to charities and who volunteer their time to charities, and significant concern about what does that trend mean for charitable sector, but for civil society more broadly. And so the commission was pulled together, through the Giving Institute and Giving USA Foundation, to spend time to do a deep dive, conducting research, which it sponsored, and taking testimony and debating, identifying issues and debating, pros and cons and ways forward and recommendations, and ultimately releasing its report in September of 2024, just a few weeks ago, really, when it comes down to it, with recommendations. And again, the focus of the commission's work was on addressing the declining number of donors and volunteers with an eye towards how do we increase it? How do we attract more people to give time and to give money into the charitable sector? One of the recommendations, from the Generosity Commission was reinforcing some of the work that has been out there about a universal charitable deduction, and looking at from several perspectives, certainly an economic perspective, a financial perspective, from a taxation and a government perspective, but also from a civil society and even First Amendment principles perspective. Unfortunately, there has been a narrative that evolved that only wealthy donors giving to charitable sector matters. And that's not at all true. Everyone's giving into the charitable sector matters. Giving of time, giving of money, giving of other resources, it all matters. But there's a growing narrative that there's a strong sense that it needed to be reversed. And the narrative, the signaling effect that could come from Congress and a universal charitable deduction is that the charitable sector matters. Our charitable sector is different. It is unique, around the world and through history. And everyone's engagement with it in support of communities, in support of the organizations and causes and people that they believe in and want to be a part of, that it matters, and that tax policy ought to reflect that as a totally different way of thinking about taxation, and a totally different way of thinking about giving to charities and the charitable deduction. So we've got two great guests here to talk about charitable giving, tax incentives. Daniel Hungerman, who's a professor of economics at the University of Notre Dame. He's co-author of a recent working paper titled Tax Incentives for Charitable Giving, New Findings from the TCJA, which, if I'm remembering right, is a NBER paper, so it has some weight, some clout, some credibility. Brian Flavin is the chair of the Charitable Giving Coalition and vice president of strategic partnerships at CASE, the Council for Advancement and Support of Education. Brian was a member of the Generosity Commission Policy Task Force, working with me and others on the task force and working with the commission more broadly. So Daniel will start. After Daniel's presentation, we'll have an opportunity to do Q&A on sort of the research side of this question of tax incentives. And so do submit your questions through the Q&A like Kelly mentioned. And then Brian will pick up the baton from there, talking about the current status of the charitable deduction and tax and tactical next steps as we go into 2025. So with that, I'll turn it over to Daniel to talk about his research findings.
Yeah, hello there. Thank you so much. I've got some slides here, so I'm going to put them up and hopefully you'll be able to see them. So I don't know, John or Kelly, if you're there, if you want to let me know. Can you see them? Oh, got the thumbs up. Great. Okay. Let me know if there's any problem with those slides. But yeah, I'm Dan Hungerman here at beautiful sunny South Bend at Notre Dame, and delighted to be here today. Thanks to the Generosity Commission for inviting me. And I'm going to take a few minutes to tell you about some work studying how the TCJA affected charitable giving. This work is joint with two co-authors, Zhao Han and Mark Otani Wilhelm. So if you're watching this webinar, you're probably aware of in broad strokes how TCJA may have affected charitable giving, but very quickly, the main effect probably involves deductibility. So charitable gifts can be deducted from one's taxable income, but people have an option to also take a standard deduction instead. And TCJA changed people's incentives when choosing between these two options. So some of the main ways it changed your incentives between choosing itemizing or taking the standard deduction would be, first, that it significantly increased the standard deduction. It also limited some of the itemizations that you could take, as is well known, for example, for SALT, state and local taxes. And because of these changes, as well as some others, a large group of taxpayers stopped itemizing their taxes, about 20% of all taxpayers. And as a result, these taxpayers lost the federal tax-based incentive to give. So in this project, we tried to think about how that would affect charitable giving. The first thing we note in this is that actually, in theory, the effect of this on giving is ambiguous. This law probably had different impacts on different types of donors, some who might give more and some who might give less. For example, if you take those who were already using the standard deduction, for these individuals, holding all else equal, the TCJA reform likely led to an increase in income. And for some taxpayers, this increase in income would be a few $1,000s. And so even if these individuals were likely to only spend a small fraction of $1 on charitable giving, if their income went up by several $1,000s, their charitable giving might have gone up by a noticeable amount. However, most people would think that a maybe more impactful group of donors would be those who are giving more already and those whose itemizable expenses in general were a little bit larger. For example, donors whose itemizable expenses put them near what the new standard deduction levels would be. We show in the paper that this, what I might call medium group of donors, donors whose itemizable expenses were near the new standard deduction cutoff, they unambiguously are going to give less as a result of this law. This law didn't, all else equal, change their income a whole lot, but it did remove their tax incentive to give. And so for this group, we have a clear prediction that we think the giving is going to go down. And then finally, we have really, really large givers out there. You might wonder whether these changes I'm discussing would matter at all for them or not. And in theory, it's ambiguous. Some of these large donors may not respond at all, but some of them could also give less as a result of this law. So the first thing we do is walk through these different scenarios. And as a result of this discussion, it looks unclear what effect the law could have. It's a question for data. So the next thing we do in the paper is we go try to get data to empirically evaluate the impact of this law on giving behavior. The data that we use comes from a large national survey that follows the same group of people over time. This survey is called the PSID, the Panel Study of Income Dynamics. It's run out of the University of Michigan, and it's conducted every other year. In this survey, they ask people detailed questions both about their charitable giving and about their tax information. The advantage of using a survey like this is that it allows us to study giving behavior both by itemizers and by non-itemizers, and importantly, for those who switch between the two types of tax filings. In scholarship like this, the other big option that people would use would be tax return data itself. Tax return data is really great for lots of things, but for this particular question, it's not so hot. That's because if this law induced lots of people to stop itemizing, a researcher can no longer see what their charitable giving behavior was. And that's what we're really interested in. So we take this survey and, put simply, we look at people who were induced to stop itemizing by the TCJA reform, and we see whether or not they give less as a result. In the paper, we talk about a lot of technical details of how we put the law to the people in this survey and how we can make sure we're really getting convincing estimates of exactly what the law does. I'm not going to talk about those technical details much, but at the end of this presentation, I'll have a link to the paper if you're curious about those. But let me start when it comes to the evidence by showing you a really, really simple picture of charitable giving over time. So this is charitable giving in the United States. This is data from Giving USA from 2011 through 2019. As you may know, the TCJA was passed in 2017. It took effect in 2018, and then 2019 is the second year in the post-TCJA world in this picture. And this figure is measured in billions. So we're ranging from 330 billion up to, a little over 450 billion. If I were to fit a simple trend line to the first part of this picture from the years 2011 to 2016, a simple trend line would look like this dashed line right here. And if I were to compare the two around the TCJA enactment, it looks, at least at a first pass, like there might have been a little bit of a bump up in 2017. So charitable giving went up a little bit that year, at least a little bit more than we might have expected from a very, very simple trend line that we would draw. And then after 2018, charitable giving doesn't really appear to continue to go up anymore, it kind of plateaus. And now it's a bit below what I would have predicted otherwise, based on this very simple trend line. So we see kind of a simple bump up, perhaps, in 2017, and then a drop down in 2018. Of course, a really simple picture like this is not in and of itself completely convincing of any effect of any law. Lots of things are happening across time. Business cycle effects, for example, the economy might do well, the stock market might do well, stuff like that. And so from looking at a simple picture like this, we can't necessarily make any strong conclusion about the impact of a tax law. Probably it's good for my job security that that's the case. But I can tell you that for this particular conversation we're having now, it turns out that this extremely simple picture showing this smaller bump in 2017 and then a bigger drop at 2018, in fact, does an extremely good job of matching what our more sophisticated analysis comes up with. So after we take our survey data and crunch the numbers, we conclude that the TCJA's passage caused giving to drop in the United States, and it caused giving to fall by about $20 billion a year. I think $20 billion is a reasonably large number. It's about 5% of total giving. Another way of thinking about the size of this effect is that we estimate that the typical household that stopped itemizing because of TCJA gave about $1,000 less to charity after it stopped itemizing. So if you take about 20 million households, it was a little more than that who stopped itemizing. And on average, they give about $1,000 less. Put those together, you get a $20 billion drop. So that's where the $20 billion number comes from. In our paper, then, we talk about several other impacts of the law that you couldn't really see from that simple picture. The first is thinking about that little bump in 2017 and figuring out exactly where that bump came from. So we propose a new method for studying that in the paper. Again, technical details are to be found there. But after looking through the data, we conclude that that bump up in 2017 that I showed you in that simple picture really does reflect some shifting of giving into the period just before the law took effect. So in 2017, sophisticated donors who knew that the law was about to change, who knew that they were about to lose their incentive to give to charity, took some of their intended future gifts and moved them from the future into 2017 so that they could make the gifts while they still had the tax incentive. We estimate that about $4 billion of giving in 2017 was because of this sort of shifting in behavior. So this sort of retiming definitely happened, and the bump that we see in the simple time series appears to be driven by that sort of retiming. But just to be clear, the drop that we see, the $20 billion drop that we see afterwards, is not primarily driven by that sort of retiming. The real story seems to be a big fall, one that goes beyond the sort of shifting that you might have imagined there. Our study also looks at a couple other details in how this law impacted giving, where we find variation both by the type of donor and by the type of charity. So first, by the type of donor. Earlier in the talk, I mentioned that we thought this law might have different impacts for different sorts of donors. That's exactly what we find in the data. When we look at smaller donors, for example, those who are already taking the standard deduction, we typically find no statistically significant impact on giving, or in some specifications, some of our results, we even find like a very small increase in charitable giving, which is about what we expected when we used an economic model to predict the impact of the law. Rather, the big drop in giving that we observe, that's coming from those whose itemizable expenses were near or above the new standard deduction cutoffs. And that's exactly what theory had predicted for us. So we see different impacts for different donors, and it's medium or large donors who are really driving the drop that we see here. Next, we find important variation by type of charitable giving. So in this survey, we can see not just how much people give, but where they give money to. The largest area of the nonprofit sector to which donations are given in this survey would be religious organizations, such as congregations. Interestingly, we find almost no impact of the law on that sort of giving. Rather, the big declines that we observe come from charitable giving to other sorts of charities and organizations. Overall, then, our conclusion is that this tax reform mattered for charitable giving. It led to a decrease in charitable giving. That decrease is sizable enough that even when you just look at a simple time series picture of total charitable giving in the United States, you can see the drop. And the drop that you see in that time series really is coming from the law. If anyone's interested, you could find the full paper at this website. The NBER allows people to download, I think, 3 papers a year for free. Anyone can download it. Although if you had any problem doing that or anything, just feel free to email me. I'd be happy to help you get a copy of the paper if you'd like. So that's the end of my slideshow.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, sure.
Just a reminder, if you have questions, we hope you do have questions, put them in the Q&A, which is at the bottom part of the webinar screen. and we'll get those questions to Daniel. So we've got a couple minutes, Daniel, to have a conversation, put some questions out there before we turn to Brian. Let me ask, is there other research that has been done looking at the effect of Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 on charitable giving? And how has that research compared with the research that you all have done?
Yeah, I know of a little bit of other work, and certainly I hope that there's going to be more. So there was a report that came out this summer that was put out by a couple people who work at AEI, American Enterprise Institute. So they use tax data. So I was talking earlier about different options here. So they focus on tax return data. And so the numbers they come up with are not quite comparable in a sense to the numbers I'm giving you, since we're asking slightly different questions. But the bottom line conclusion that they reach is in spirit similar to ours, which is that the TCJA reform caused a decrease in giving, and that the big driver of this decrease was probably changes in itemization taken by taxpayers.
Okay. Are there so that's a couple your research and their research. Is there research that's sort of in process, and that maybe as because the chart that you showed had 2019, is there research that's going to maybe be able to update numbers and update information as new data becomes available and more recent, or just otherwise updating research?
Yeah, certainly. So that's the plan. In kind of two steps. So the first is that uh, as we get some more data from the PSID coming, or from other data sources, we hope to first look at the pandemic, how that might have interacted with charitable giving along with existing tax laws. There were some changes to the tax treatment of giving during the pandemic, as you're probably aware. They probably weren't quite as big a deal as these impacts of TCJA, but that's still something that we hope to look at. Also, if TCJA sticks around for a long time, Brian will probably have more to say about that in a few minutes. Something I get asked about a lot is like bunching of gifts. So you might imagine that there are some donors who might only itemize every once in a while, and then when they itemize, they do like a lot of giving. Certainly, I think that that's possible. Whether and how that would work, and the extent to which current tax policy would drive that sort of bunching behavior, that's something that hopefully we'll learn more about over the next few years as we continue to kind of collect more data. And then a final follow-up that's in the works right now is I'm doing some work with the assistance or cooperation of the U.S. Treasury Department to look at charitable giving of the super wealthy. So, John, as you mentioned at the start, part of the conversation of charitable giving right now is about the role of the very wealthy in really large charitable gifts. I really agree with you that there's more to the story than just giving of the super wealthy. I think you're absolutely right about that. But I think we lack a great picture of the giving of the super rich, and how it responds to policy or other economic conditions. And so right now I'm doing work with the Treasury Department to kind of hopefully get some more information we can use to learn some important new information about that. So there's hopefully going to be lots more to learn in the near future before too long.
But I do think, some of the research that was commissioned by the Generosity Commission showed that, and I think this is consistent with some of the points that you made, in particular, the point about giving to congregations not affected, but giving to other organizations was affected, or other types of organizations. I think some of the commission's research showed that that some of the major drop off in the numbers of people giving were in low moderate income folks who are more likely to be giving to smaller, newer, community-based organizations that aren't necessarily going to be on the radar of the super wealthy. And so the different types of effects on charitable organizations based on who is opting out of charitable giving and trying to get them back into, back into giving and to supporting those organizations that they are likely closest to as part of that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm, both on what you say about how, in the nonprofit sector now, we see some kind of important shifts in how giving is happening. So the declines that you mentioned, yeah, absolutely. They are primarily driven by low and moderate income individuals. That's my sense also. It's also involving a shift a little bit in the charities that are getting some of these donations. So while this research I just showed suggests that TCJA itself did not necessarily cause a huge drop in giving to congregations, we also know that giving to religious congregations is, at best flatlined or going down in recent years, and that to the extent there's been, a growing, size in the nonprofit sector, it's not coming from that. So there are these important shifts in who's giving and where it's going, and something to keep in mind as if large donors continue to become more important, is that where they want to give money, their preferences, may lead to kind of a change in what the charitable market looks like. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, and as you rightly point out, giving to congregations has decreased. So has attendance, participation,
Yes.
engagement with congregations has also decreased. And some of what the commission research showed is people who are engaged with their congregation are more likely to donate to charity and more likely to volunteer and more likely to engage in civil society. There's a chicken or egg question that's in all of that, but the reality is that the research shows there is connectivity among that. And and then part of that too, to shift gears a little bit, is the sense of belonging that is certainly challenging, for many in society today. And engagement with congregations, engagement with charities is a way to enhance that sense of belonging. Daniel, thank you. Appreciate it. And we will be
Sure.
back to you. This isn't the only opportunity to ask Daniel questions. Certainly continue to add them in the Q&A as we shift to Brian. Daniel, thank you. So, as I mentioned, Brian will help guide us into the future, beginning with the current state of the charitable deduction, but also looking at prospects and possibilities for Tax Cut Jobs Act of 2025. Brian?
Great. Thank you, John. And I just first want to say both thanks to you for your work with the Generosity Commission, and of course, thanks to the Generosity Commission and the staff. It was such a privilege to be a part of the process, to be on the policy task force. And John, along with Art Taylor, who was the co-chair, did a great job of co-chairing the policy task force group. So I just want to acknowledge that and thank you for your leadership. And also to the Generosity Commission for putting a program like this on today. And also thanks to Dan for the research. There was no collaboration beforehand to know this research was going to come out when it did. But sometimes I've been doing this work and doing policy work in a long time. Sometimes when you're advocating and lobbying on particular issues, research comes out that's just really, really helpful and kind of confirms what you've been seeing, what you've been hearing from members, but also helps with making sure that we're telling a factual story to lawmakers. So it was really, really helpful to have Dan's study out there as a part of this process. I'm going to share some slides just like Dan did. Let me just share really quick and make sure everybody can see these once they're up. And we'll go through just a few slides just to kind of walk you through kind of what we're seeing. Hopefully everybody can see my slides on tax reform and the charitable deduction. I'm going to just start with a little bit of background. Thanks, John. With a little bit of background about the coalition itself. So the coalition has actually been around since 2009, and it is a voluntary coalition. So it is a coalition of charitable organizations, associations, companies, others who are really committed to preserving and expanding the charitable tax deduction. So the charitable tax deduction has been in the tax code for over 100 years now. It's been a cherished tradition that has been such a kind of unique feature of the American philanthropic landscape, but also been such an important driver of support and driving the missions of the charitable organizations in the sector as a whole. Our coalition includes members from large national organizations, such as the organization I work for. I'm VP of Strategic Partnerships for CASE. So we represent colleges, universities, and independent schools who lead the fundraising, alumni relations, and communications marketing functions at those schools. So we obviously have a very much of an interest in giving to educational institutions, but also includes organizations like the Association of Fundraising Professionals, the American Red Cross, United Way Worldwide, Jewish Federations of North America, many organizations like that. And also, as I said, state and local organizations as well. We all came together back in 2009 because at the time there was an effort to limit the itemized charitable deduction, which Daniel talked about quite a bit. At the time, there was an effort to kind of limit that by the Obama administration. We came together to really work to preserve and protect the charitable deduction, arguing that it was different than other itemized deductions in that you get a benefit for the more you give away. And that was something that we'd want to preserve, and it is critical in terms of driving support and resources to the charitable sector. Over time, we've continued to obviously work to preserve and protect the itemized charitable deduction, but with the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, got very concerned about what that would mean for giving in general, as Daniel laid out very clearly. What's happened with the number of itemizers, and of course, you can only deduct charitable gifts if you're an itemizing taxpayer. So that's really kind of our kind of how we came about and how we've been engaged and involved. And as I said, an all volunteer organization, all with people like me who have other day jobs, but who work. Of course, this is an interest of CASE. Many organizations to expand the charitable deduction and the ability for every American to give back to charity. So I just want to share a quote I just want to give you a context of kind of and I'm assuming most of us on this virtual call have a particular viewpoint about charitable giving and its importance and generally support the idea of a charitable tax deduction. I may be making some assumptions there, but just making that general assumption. But there are those out there who are very influential in the tax reform debate that's to come who don't share that view. I'm going to talk a little bit again about the TCJ in a second, but this is just a quote from somebody, Scott Hodge, who is the president emeritus of the Tax Foundation, which is a think tank that was very influential in the development of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and particularly working with Republicans up on the Hill on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But you can see his argument is we should just get essentially rid of the charitable tax deduction altogether, that it doesn't provide any real incentive, and it's only really a benefit for the wealthy. So I just provide that to show you that as we enter tax reform next year, and what will certainly be a pretty substantial and significant year around taxes and the tax code in the US, that there are voices out there who are questioning even the veracity of the itemized charitable deduction, not to mention the ability to expand this deduction to non-itemizers. And really, again, this story starts with the work of the Generosity Commission, and as John laid out so well, one of the recommendations of the Generosity Commission is around increasing the availability of the charitable contribution tax deduction. It really is a way. It's not a magic bullet. It's not going to solve the issue of increasing the number of donors and volunteers, but it certainly helps if there's a giving incentive there, encourage more giving, encouraging those who are giving smaller amounts or giving donations at all to give more to charity. And that's, of course, something that's important for the future of the charitable sector and also for the work that many of our organizations do. So really, it was helpful to have the Generosity Commission's report, and really because of the timing of the Generosity Commission's report and recommendations, along with the timing of tax reform, we really do have an opportunity next year. And it all starts with the fact that that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a significant portion of that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, TCJA, expires at the end of 2025. And just as a little quick refresher, we talked a lot about, and obviously Daniel's research focused quite a bit on the doubling of the standard deduction and its impact on charitable giving. But there were other things that also impacted charitable giving as well in TCJA. The decrease in the overall marginal tax rates. When tax rates decline, the cost of giving actually goes up. So that probably had some impact on giving overall. Obviously, the doubling of standard deduction, which had the most significant impact, and the data has definitely shown that. There was an increase in the AGI limitation, the adjusted gross income limitation, from 50% of AGI to 60%. So individuals could give up to 60% of their adjusted gross income every year. So that would be in the other direction, incentivizing additional giving, and it likely did a bit, but again, not enough to offset the doubling of the standard deduction. There also was some higher gift and estate tax thresholds that were included as well, which if you, depending on your viewpoint on the estate tax, the presence of any estate tax and lower thresholds potentially leads to more bequest giving. So the higher those thresholds could lead to less bequest giving around that. And that's not to mention there are other smaller provisions in the college university world. I'm thinking of the priority seating for athletics that was repealed entirely, that were also had on the margins an impact on charitable giving. So all of those things had an impact on charitable giving, and all of those are going to expire unless Congress and the administration take action by December 31st, 2025. So when we say there is a high likelihood of tax reform happening next year, it is incredibly high likelihood. And now, particularly given the results of the election, even more so a high likelihood of tax reform happening. And again, which opens up an opportunity to expand the charitable deduction. As Daniel alluded to, we went from a world where we had 30% of taxpayers who were itemizing pre-TCJA, so 30% of Americans who had the opportunity to deduct their charitable gifts, to as of the most recent data, we're down to 7.5%. We were saying 10% when the law just passed, but because of the continuing the fact that the standard deduction threshold continues to index with inflation and continues to go up, it right now is sitting at for this tax year will be at around $15,000 for individuals, $30,000 for couples. The number of itemizers has continued to go down. So we're at about 7.5% of Americans. So that's 7.5% of Americans who can deduct their charitable gifts in any year using the itemized charitable deduction. Now, that's a critically important that we have an itemized charitable deduction. It does incentivize additional giving. But the fact that you have such a small percentage of Americans who have a charitable giving incentive certainly has been of concern of the Charitable Giving Coalition, but also from a democratizing giving perspective and ensuring that all Americans have an incentive to give is also concerning. So one of the things that we're hoping to do and what we've been really working towards is incentivizing charitable giving. I include this picture because the election results actually have put in hyperdrive or hyper-focus tax reform. So we obviously have a former president coming back into the presidency in January. But what it also looks like that we're going to have a Republican Congress that he'll be working with, very similar to the circumstances of the TCJA back in 2017. Why does this matter? Well, when you have Republicans that control both the presidency, the House, and the Senate, it means it opens up a special type of legislative vehicle called budget reconciliation that allows a particular Congress to pass something, and particularly the Senate to pass critical legislation with needing only 51 votes in the Senate. So typically to get anything through the Senate, you need 60 votes, which means it has to be bipartisan. But if you use budget tax reconciliation, if you use reconciliation, you can essentially bypass that requirement. So Republicans can pass a Republican tax reform bill. And that's what happened in 2017. But one of the downsides of using reconciliation is that you do have to keep it within a certain cost window. There are cost considerations and requirements. So what Republicans decided to do back in 2017 was they decided to pass a permanent corporate tax reduction, but then on the individual side, pass tax cuts, but make them temporary so that they would expire as of December 31st, 2025. So that's why we have this deadline next year, and why if Republicans do, which I full-heartedly believe they will, consider reconciliation again to get tax reform passed, they will also have to be mindful of the budget and those budget rules so that they can use that fast track process to get tax reform legislation through. So we are looking at a very, very quick focused tax reform. If the election outcome had been different, we would have been looking most likely at divided government, which would have slowed things down. Particularly, there's clear differences of opinion on taxes between Republicans and Democrats, but Republicans are pretty much aligned on how they want to approach the expiration of the TCJA, with some big exceptions in there, of course. And of course, it looks like Republicans, as I said, will have the House majority, but it's going to be a very, very slim majority in the House. So while they want to fast track tax reform, they are certainly still going to have to work through issues to make it happen. But we are looking at a much, much quicker, faster timeframe for tax reform next year. So what are we doing as the Charitable Giving Coalition? Well, really since 2017, we've been building bipartisan support for a charitable deduction for non-itemizers. So bringing a charitable deduction to those 93% of Americans who don't have a charitable giving incentive right now. Trying to capture some of those, as Daniel mentioned in his research, some of those taxpayers who went from itemizing under pre-TCJA to non-itemizing and taking the standard deduction post-TCJA. So we right now have been pushing in this Congress the Charitable Act, which is a bill that would restore and expand a charitable deduction for non-itemizers. It would allow non-itemizers to give up to $4,600 roughly. It's actually closer now to $5,000 given the increase in the standard deduction threshold. For $4,600 for individuals, $9,200 for joint filers each year. And it really, it would also allow those gifts to donor advised funds as well. But essentially, it's what we like to call around the Beltway and up here in DC, we like to call it a marker bill. So it's what we would love to see in tax reform. We would love to see a generous charitable deduction for non-itemizers with, while we're not usually fans of caps, if you're thinking about a donor giving above $4,600 or $9,200 joint filers, they're likely already itemizers. So we think we're capturing most non-itemized giving with this generous cap. So I call it a marker bill because that's what we would love to see. The reality is we'll likely see something anywhere between what we have now, which is zero charitable deduction for non-itemizers, so no ability to deduct charitable gifts, to the marker that we have set with this bill, which is $4,600 and $9,200. So all of our work at the coalition level has been around building bipartisan support for this. And one of the reasons we've been so focused on bipartisan support is this is a bipartisan issue. We are fortunate to have strong champions on both sides of Capitol Hill. On the Senate side, we have almost a quarter of the Senate now who are co-sponsors, either sponsoring or co-sponsoring the Charitable Act. Our leads are Senator James Lankford, who is a Republican from Oklahoma, and who's a member of the Finance Committee. Our lead Democrat is Chris Coons, who is a Democrat from Delaware in the Senate. And we also have 3 Senate Finance Committee Republican co-sponsors as well: Senator Lankford, Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina, Senator Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee. On the House side, equally strong bipartisan support with our House leads who are on the Ways and Means Committee, Representative Blake Moore, from a Republican from Utah, Representative Danny Davis, who's a Democrat from Illinois, Representative Michelle Steele, who actually is still in a tough re-election battle in California, but who is one of our lead sponsors on the House Ways and Means Committee on the Republican side. And then Chris Pappas, who's not on the Ways and Means Committee, but has been a strong champion for this, who's a Democrat from New Hampshire. We also have, as you can see, a lot of Ways and Means Republican support. And I'm focusing on Republicans because they are going to be in the driver's seat when it comes to championing and building and drafting tax reform legislation next year, given the political circumstances. So you can see we have strong bipartisan support, or I should say strong Republican support on both sides of Capitol Hill to restore and expand a charitable deduction for non-itemizers. So we have a huge, huge opportunity next year with tax reform. So we have key champions, which I just referenced and mentioned. So we are well positioned, key bipartisan support, which is always critical with moving things up on Capitol Hill. We have a sector, particularly through the Charitable Giving Coalition, and I know a number of you are involved and supportive of expanding a charitable giving incentive. And we also have evidence of need, which Daniel really laid out in his research and the research we've seen from others, which have shown a dip, particularly among a dip in those givers who used to be itemizers who are now non-itemizers post TCJA. And frankly, a need to encourage and incentivize more giving across the charitable sector. We've seen, even with Giving USA the past couple of years, we've seen a decline in inflation-adjusted giving. So really an evidence of need. We know our organizations, our charitable organizations out there need the additional support. So we have really a tremendous, tremendous opportunity next year in tax reform, and we need to make the most of it. We've positioned ourselves well on the Hill, but we now need to unite and build and bring the energy to the debate. And that's where you can be involved and be helpful. We are actually prepping a letter that's going to go out on Giving Tuesday, kind of reinforcing and leveraging that big opportunity of focus on giving. That is going to focus on the importance of restoring and expanding a charitable deduction for non-itemizers. It'll go to congressional leaders. So if you use this QR code, this will take you to the sign-on form for that letter. Many of you have already signed it. Thank you. But you can sign on to that letter. And there's also an opportunity there for you to learn more about the Charitable Giving Coalition. And I should mention about the coalition, we are a free coalition. There's no dues. So you just have to join the coalition. So if you go to that QR code, sign on to the letter, there's also an opportunity where you can get more information about the CGC. We also really think it's really critically important that we spread the word about this opportunity we have on the Hill. So spreading the word about the Charitable Giving Coalition with both your peers, and for those of you who are companies with clients of yours, making sure they're aware of this opportunity, that we do have a real chance of really a game changer in terms of charitable giving and preserving and protecting charitable giving moving forward next year. So spreading the word is another way that you can be helpful. And then, of course, there are other ways through the Charitable Giving Coalition. And if you're interested in this, you can always certainly follow up with me directly to help support the coalition in other ways, including financially support our work as we continue and approach this next year moving forward. So lots of ways that you can support and be helpful. And I just want to reiterate again how critically important and how much of an opportunity we have next year to really do something that will help us achieve that Generosity Commission goal of expanding the charitable deduction to more Americans and hopefully help start to reverse that decline in giving that in number of donors that we've seen over the past couple of decades. So with that, let me stop sharing my screen. And John, I'll turn it over to you to see if we have any questions based on that.
Thank you, Brian, for wonderful, insightful, and deep presentation, but also for your leadership with the Charitable Giving Coalition and all of those involved with that work. That has been momentous work that has paid dividends and but is still necessary and continues to support the sector in important ways. So appreciate all of that. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. Will the lame duck session be an opportunity for the Charitability Act or for the Charitable Act?
Charitable Act. It's a very good question. So based on the results of the election, I am not optimistic that there'll be an opportunity in a lame duck session. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So the lame duck session, just for the Washington speak, for those of you, so that's really the time period between the election and the seating of a new Congress and the inauguration, where you have a lot of lawmakers who have either retired, they've been defeated, but they're still essentially lawmakers until the new Congress sits in early January. Typically, those are actually some of the most robust legislative times for Congress. Congress is nothing if not procrastinates when it comes to waiting till deadlines to get things done. So they will have to do something in the lame duck around spending. They passed a continuing resolution through December. A lot of what we're hearing right now is they're going to pass a continuing resolution for funding for FY25 through into next year, so that the new Congress, the new president, can have a say in that funding. So if they're going to do that, the chances they're going to do tax reform are very, very low, any sort of tax bill. And then we have one particular piece of evidence that I think is really important to point to that gives you a sense of why it's unlikely. So there was a bipartisan tax bill that didn't include the Charitable Act earlier this year, but had a lot of popular provisions that was supported by both sides of the aisle. That got a lot of, it was really a negotiated tax deal between the Republican chair of the Ways and Means Committee, Jason Smith, a Republican from Missouri, and the Democratic chair of the Senate Finance Committee, Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon. They came to an agreement. They got it through the House of Representatives, which is no easy feat. But then it hit the wall, which was the Senate Republicans. They were not a part of those negotiations. And Senator Crapo, who is now poised to become the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, was a really, really key part in making sure that bill didn't go any forward. And their whole rationale for that was, we're going to have a better chance to shape this next year when we think we'll have control of the Senate and have a majority. So if you look at it that way, the chances of them giving really Democrats a chance to shape this in any meaningful way as a majority in the Senate, and also the president, frankly, President Biden, to have any chance in this is very, very slim. So I don't think we're going to see it in the lame duck session, though we'll certainly be continuing to push for it.
Thank you, Brian. Another question, is looking at connecting, the universal charitable deduction and the approach to tax incentives generally.
Mm-hmm.
Do you anticipate that any charitable or tax legislation will include any curbs on the use of donor advised funds?
That's a very good question. Obviously, there's been a lot of focus and attention and scrutiny of donor advised funds over the past few years. And there are some champions up on the Hill. I know on the Senate side, Senator King, who's an independent from Maine, along with Senator Grassley, Republican from Iowa, have been very much, they've introduced legislation on donor advised funds, the Accelerating Charitable Efforts Act.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, there always is a possibility whenever you open up the tax code and you start to look at things for for that issue to come up and for potentially there to be a focus on that as part of tax reform. What you really need, though, for that to happen is you need somebody on the committee, either committee staff or on the committees in the Senate or the House, really driving that and championing that. And there are a couple of things that I think we need to watch on the donor advised front part. One is, number one, the community is divided on donor advised funds. There are a lot of voices on either side. So if lawmakers are going to tackle that, they tackle that in the knowledge that they are tackling something that there's not kind of united support behind, very different than the charitable deduction for non-itemizers. That doesn't mean they won't do it, but that means that there's an extra level of effort involved in that. The second piece is there's still some regulatory work happening back from the last time donor advised fund regulations were passed back in 2006. And I think we're still awaiting some Treasury reaction to some numerous comments that were received. And you could certainly see lawmakers say, and again, we're going to have new folks in Treasury, so we'll have to see what they say, saying, you know what, we need to figure out, these comments and figure out the right regulatory structure based on the last bill that we're still working on before we think of new stuff. So there's that piece that could potentially impact it as well. But it really will come down to whether there's a lawmaker on the Finance Committee or the Ways and Means Committee, and frankly, a Republican lawmaker who wants to make it a priority. Obviously, Senator Grassley's still a key voice on the Finance Committee. He's not chair, so he's not driving it as much, but he still, if he wanted to, could certainly pursue something on the donor advised fund part. But you also have to think about it from a revenue perspective. What sort of revenue could they raise by going after donor advised funds? Really, the only way you raise revenue is if you put penalties on not abiding by particular rules. They're not going to raise a lot of revenue from that. So that could also be another way that it would have to be really a messaging effort if they wanted to do something on donor advised funds. But we'll certainly be watching that. It's a very good question.
Thank you, Brian. A couple more questions. One is, what's the biggest impediment to getting a charitable deduction for non-itemizers?
The biggest impediment is cost. As I mentioned, Republicans are going to use reconciliation. They have to abide by budget rules to use reconciliation. The president-elect in the campaign put a lot of new potential tax priorities, even talked about rolling back the state and local tax deduction cap that he was supportive of back in 2017. He put a lot of those on the table potentially for tax reform. The question is, how much do Republicans and the administration push those in tax reform, and how much does that push up the cost? The charitable, really my hope is we built enough support and an evidence of need, and we have the champions in place to make sure we get something. But the question is, how big is that something going to be? And we were very fortunate during the pandemic. In 2020 and 2021, we had a very modest charitable deduction for non-itemizers that was passed as part of pandemic relief legislation, but it was only $300 for individuals, $600 for joint filers. We do have evidence that it did help generate additional giving, but we certainly would like to see a much more robust charitable deduction for non-itemizers back in the code as a part of this. So to the extent that cost becomes even more of an overriding issue, anything you put back into the code that is, while we would argue if you're generating more return from the charitable giving you're generating, the reality is up on Capitol Hill, they're only looking at cost. And they have to fit it into that particular puzzle. They have to put that together. And to the extent we add a lot of cost through the charitable deduction for non-itemizers, the extent that they start to shrink it and ultimately could say, you know what, we don't have the money to do it. Hopefully they don't get there, but that I think is our number one obstacle.
Well, and politically, it could be tricky to offset that with reducing the standard deduction as a way to balance out, but that could be politically tricky.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think your answer gets to this question a little bit, but there's some nuance in the question that I want to give you a chance to address. Is there a risk of a trade-off that an increase in the charitable deduction will be offset with wider taxation of large endowments?
Well,
another way of balancing.
So that's where my role as chair of the Charitable Giving Coalition hits me pretty closely as my other role, which is VP of Strategic Partnerships, the case. Absolutely, we're watching that very closely. And I would even extend that beyond taxing of endowments. I mentioned that quote from Scott Hodge from the Tax Foundation. He's also said a lot about supporting and thinking Congress should, instead of thinking about the corporate tax rate, which I don't think anybody thinks at this stage the corporate tax rate is going to be raised in any meaningful way given the political circumstances by Republicans, but was arguing before the election that instead of raising the corporate tax rate, you should actually tax those nonprofits who have nonprofit status, but they're really more like businesses. So he bunched hospitals and universities and some others together. So I do think that we do have to watch that very carefully. The committee, particularly the House Ways and Means Committee, has been very focused on the charitable sector and both political interference, foreign donations, whether charities are being used for political ends, that there is certainly some real risk of them looking at those areas as ways to quote unquote offset what a charitable deduction for non-itemizers would cost. The reality is, I mean, they're looking at a bigger picture package. So any of the stuff that affects just our sector is not going to really be meaningful overall, but you could certainly see some messaging provisions or, provisions meant to send a message to the sector that are included. So we're certainly going to have to watch that as we balance both our push for a charitable deduction for non-itemizers, but also ensuring that the charitable sector remains and has the ability to achieve its mission moving forward.
And I think, the point you just made about, we do need to be paying attention to the upcoming Congress. I mean, a whole host of reasons, a whole host of things related to missions and programming, and but tax incentives as well, and other potential provisions that could affect the sector. We saw some of those come out with in 2017 that the sector rallied around and got Congress to pull back on several of them, which was pretty remarkable, but also I think very wise. So, and you had the slide with the QR code, which I assume that is available through the Charitable Giving Coalition's website, so they can get at that. But what are some of the other ways, in addition to working through and supporting Charitable Giving Coalition, what are some other ways that people can follow up with elected officials to engage, directly with our folks on the Hill?
Absolutely. And, obviously we would love to have as many folks involved in the coalition's work, and we're going to keep everybody updated on what's happening and where to weigh in. But there certainly are other ways that you can support a charitable deduction for non-itemizers. I shared in my slides the bill numbers for the Charitable Act. Anytime you're talking with lawmakers, bringing up the Charitable Act, making sure you check to see if they've co-sponsored it, encouraging them to co-sponsor those bills if they haven't, are ways that you can be helpful. I think weighing in, looking for efforts, whether it's the Charitable Giving Coalition's efforts or frankly, a lot of our members of the coalition and associations who are involved in this space, who are looking both at charitable giving, but at the sector as a whole, are also weighing in. So signing on to letters, joining webinars like this that are kind of giving you an update on what's happening, it's going to move fast. So I think keeping informed is going to be the most critical thing that you can do, and working with lawmakers. Some of them are going to understand what you do more than others. But if you take the time to get to know them, to get to know their staff in particular, and share your views, get a bill, get this bill in front of them, get this issue in front of them, whether they jump in and co-sponsor or not, just by doing that, you're doing a great service to the effort to move this forward and to keep the issue visible. There's going to be a lot of noise next year from a lot of different groups wanting lots of different things from tax reform. So if we really want to take advantage of this opportunity, we must be strong, energetic, very squeaky, to say a squeaky wheel, of course, and weighing in with lawmakers and keeping this in front of them, or we'll miss the opportunity. And we certainly don't want to do that.
Yeah, and I would add to that, and not necessarily add, but reinforce active engagement with the coalitions, the infrastructure groups that are taking the lead and working together on these things, making sure they know that they've got our support is going to be critical for us staying informed as individuals in the sectors, organizations in the sector, but as also us to have pathways to engage with policymakers. And I would jump on what you said towards the end, and engage with policymakers.
Yep.
They come back home invite them to your charity, to your organization. Meet with them you don't have to go to DC. If you're in DC, great, meet with them. If you're going to be in DC, meet, great with, but when they are at home in community, we are part of that community. We're an important part of that community. The more they can understand that and see it and appreciate it, and the effect it's got on their constituents, the more likely they are to look favorably on the sector and policies that support and then maybe even advocate for the sector, including the signaling effects for and economic effects for the charitable deduction for non-itemizers. Brian, thank you. Daniel, thank you. And for folks on the webinar, thank you for being here. Thank you for the wonderful questions. Kelly, thank you for organizing us and keeping us on track. And look forward to more conversations, in the year ahead. There's a lot coming and a lot to be doing. So thank you both, and we look forward to your future work as well. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.